Hi everyone, and welcome back to my tiny house in the forest. In this video I want to talk about a topic that I don't normally discuss as much, but since many of you have asked me about the rules and regulations for tiny houses in Denmark, I thought that I wanted to make this small video about that topic. But obviously these rules do not apply to all tiny houses everywhere in the world, but hopefully this video can still give some inspiration for those of you who want to build or buy a tiny house, because the rules and regulations are one of the most crucial aspects that you will need to consider if you want to go tiny, as they say. So I've been interested in this topic for a number of years now, obviously because I live in a tiny house and I've done so for a little over 4 years now. And in that time period I can observe how the general interest for tiny houses and tiny living among Danes has just grown exponentially, not only on social media platforms but also in the media in general. So I have lost count about how many times I've been in an article and in some TV program or in the radio, because I'm one of the few people who stand out in terms of talking about tiny living, because a lot of people in Denmark, they live tiny under the radar because it's not too easy to do it legally. And then also I do quite a few presentations about tiny living all around the country. Again, because the interest is so big, and there are always a lot of questions and a lot of people showing up. So it is just indicative of how big the interest for this topic is in Denmark. And naturally I've gained some ideas and knowledge about tiny living also from the legal perspective. So in this video I want to dissect kind of like the 3 main models for legally living in a tiny house in Denmark. But before I go into this, I'll just briefly explain some legal background information. Because here in Denmark we have something called the city zone. And it is within the city zone that most people actually live. And it is also the easiest way to get allowance to build a house. It is if you do it within the city zone, at least if you want to live there all year round. And then we have something called the countryside zone. And it is obviously meant for agricultural production, so it is not so easy to put up an extra new house in the countryside zone, because that is meant for agricultural production. And then we have the summer house zone, which is where people can live in their summer houses, but obviously not all year round because it is a summer house. But I'll talk a little bit more about these zones during the video. So the first model for living legally in a tiny house in Denmark would be just to buy a regular property within the city zone. So here you could easily just put on a tiny house and then go live there, if the tiny house lives up to the rules for all year living. But those rules are pretty strict here in Denmark. So you would have like a roof that would be maybe half a meter thick and the walls maybe 40 centimeters. So it's a little bit preposterous that you would need to build such a thick house in a way just to be able to live there. But these rules are meant for bigger houses, so the same rules more or less apply to also tiny houses, and it is a little bit silly. And then at the same time, it is also a little bit expensive to build such a house, because you would need to hire like an engineer to do some calculations about energy efficiency of the house, and also maybe some architects to send in some drawings for the municipality, and it can easily become like a very expensive project. So some people actually choose to buy a prefabricated tiny house, which is totally possible, but they will cost you like 1 million Danish crowns, which if you also have to buy the property and also have to hire in professionals to do the technical stuff about the application, then it can easily exclude a lot of people, maybe in particular young people, who dream about living in a tiny house but might not have 2 million Danish crowns for the process of building it and also getting it approved. But there is another option within Model 1 that might be a little bit more achievable for most people. And that would be to buy like a very old and rundown house or old farm and then place the tiny house on that property as an annex. Because then you will have access to a legal bathroom and toilet and kitchen in the main house. And then it will be easier for you to make the application. But you could still have like a mini toilet within the tiny house. because you can have a compost toilet, at least if you live in the countryside zone, maybe on an old farm. Then you can dispose of the compost in the soil, and it will be perfectly legal. And then if you live in the city zone, you could have like a gas toilet that burns the shit. So these are some of the possibilities that you have if you want to live legally in a tiny house on a normal property all year round. So the second model that you can use would be to buy a summer house property and then build your tiny house as a summer house on that property. The plus side of this is that it is much easier and also cheaper to build a tiny house as a summer house, because the building requirements are not as strict. Like you can have like 150 millimeters insulation in the walls, 200 in the floor and 250 in the roof. So you would not have to put as many resources into the project, which would make it much cheaper and also much more sustainable. However, the downside obviously is that most people are not allowed to live all year in the summer house, because it is a summer house. But some people are actually, and it could be relevant for those people. Like one of my neighbors, he has a note from his doctor saying that he should be living in a quiet area. So that note was just given to the municipality, and then they just approved him living out here full time, even though he's a young guy, only a little older than me. So for some people it is actually a possibility to live in their tiny house on a summer house property. And that is actually also what I do. But I'm not living here all year round, namely because it's not legal for me, because I don't have a note from my doctor and I'm not retired yet. So I need to be creative every winter in terms of figuring out what I want to do with my half of my winter. And sometimes I'm living with a girlfriend maybe, and then I'm living with my family, and then I'm maybe traveling. So I can draw on different strings, but I must say it is a bit of a sacrifice, but nonetheless one that I'm willing to pay for the time being, because I don't have a family and kids to look after. So right now I can just do whatever I want, but it is maybe not a viable solution for me in the future. The third model for living legally in a tiny house in Denmark is to live in one of the actual tiny house villages that are being built at the moment. And just the other day I went to one of these villages to see the grand opening, because here we have this small group of citizens who have worked together with a local municipality about creating what is called a local plan for this new tiny house village. And they are all about sustainability, like sharing resources and building with sustainable materials, and also growing their own food and collecting their own rainwater and solar energy. And then they have this common house where they can share tools and like washing machines, and also they can use the house if anyone is to throw a party or maybe having a birthday get together, something like that. Then they can use the common house for that, and then they just live with themselves or with their families in these small units that are up to like 40 square meters per house, I think it is. There is only a handful of houses in the village right now, but I think it has space enough for up to 20 or maybe 30 tiny houses. And it is just such an interesting model to see how you can also live in a tiny house. And actually more and more tiny house villages are being built in the near future here in Denmark. One of the other tiny house villages that are being built at the moment is just outside of Copenhagen, which is our capital city. And they are also super interesting because they have been co-creating with the authorities a piece of legislation that makes it a little easier to build and live full time in a tiny house. And they are actually testing this piece of legislation this year because they are building the new houses according to that. So it is just so interesting to see all that's going on here in Denmark with the tiny house villages. And I can't wait to see in the future if Denmark becomes a tiny house nation, because I know that so many Danes are so interested in this type of living. So that was my 3 models for living legally in a tiny house in Denmark. But of course the rules may not be the same in your country, but still I hope it can give some inspiration, because I can see in the comment section that a lot of people are actually struggling with the question of how they can live legally in their tiny house. And as you have seen in this video, sometimes change can happen at a local level when local communities are working together with the municipality. So I hope it can give some inspiration at least. So that was all for me. Have a nice weekend and see you again next week.